Why is saying I do costing Americans more than ever? I'm Sammy Cohen, and this is Social Currency, a podcast that unpacks the stories that are shaping business, culture, and the intersection of the two. In today's episode of Social Currency, we explore the age-old process of matrimony, the celebrations surrounding it, and why getting married today can literally be as expensive or even more expensive as a down payment on a home. The wedding industry looks a lot different today than it did for our parents' generation. And in prior generations that relied on reliving their wedding memories in a printed physical photo album, there wasn't as robust of a wedding ecosystem in place to support this wedding industrial complex that we're seeing today. Today, the U.S. wedding services industry is a behemoth that's estimated to be worth around $65 to $70 billion in 2025. The wedding industry has become so big and expensive compared to household income that people who are getting married today are either spending significantly more on their weddings compared to prior generations, or they're deciding to scale down their weddings to microweddings for a significantly smaller guest list than prior generations had. And today we'll talk about what's going on in the industry, the rising costs, the major industry players, registry economics, how social media fuels the growth of the industry, and some wedding trends that I'm predicting we are going to see even more of over the next few years. So first, let's talk about the economics of weddings. The average U.S. wedding now costs over $30,000 per 2024 figures from the Knot. And according to the Knot, the percentage breakdown of expenses for these wedding categories falls into the following buckets. 27% goes to a wedding venue and rentals, 24% goes to catering, cake, and drinks, 10% goes to photography and video, 9% goes to floral and decor, and 8% goes to music. Over the last few years, couples hired 14 wedding vendors on average. Now, to state the obvious, the past few years have been very inflationary, and wedding vendor costs have been increasing because of this. Yet, there are also these additional markups for anything that's even labeled wedding that fall well outside of inflation. A commonly referenced example of this is the fact that a plain white cake can cost up to several times more when it's called a wedding cake versus just a party cake. And another example of one of these add-on fees is the cake cutting fee, which is a rate that many wedding venues charge when a couple brings in their own wedding cake from an outside bakery. And it's not uncommon for caterers or venues to charge a $5 per person cake cutting fee, and it's usually buried somewhere in the fine print of a contract. And the fact that all of these wedding related products cost more than the exact same version for an occasion other than a wedding, that's all backed by studies. And a 2016 study from Consumer Reports found that 28% of vendors quoted a higher price for weddings compared to an otherwise identical anniversary party. And since the study is from almost a decade ago, I'd bet that this percentage has increased over time. And of course, after the COVID lockdowns, there was this massive wedding boom with 2.5 million weddings in 2022, which was the highest number of weddings since 1984. And this wedding surge meant that prices for all wedding-related products and services increased significantly compared to prior years. And there's also been this rise in destination weddings due to the overall cost of weddings in the US. Many people have realized that they can get married internationally for a much lower all-in cost than you can in the US. But of course, that usually shrinks the guest list, and any guest that comes to an international wedding is going to obviously pay more out of pocket to attend. And on a personal note, I ended up getting married in South Africa. My husband is South African, and I expected it to be way cheaper than it actually was. We ended up getting married at a gorgeous venue, and it was all very beautiful, but it wasn't as cheap as I expected it to be, considering how strong the dollar is against the rand. I'm sure I was getting a crazy markup in prices because I was an international client. I know that other countries do the same thing with their US international clients as well. But even though it was more than I expected to pay, it was still so much less than I would have paid if I had done the exact same wedding, the same caliber of wedding in the US. And what stands out to me about the state of weddings in 2025 is this. Just like so many of the other traditional tokens of the American dream, going to college, buying a home, having children all before the age of 30, having a nice wedding with a big guest list is out of reach for so many Americans. And just like everything that I just mentioned, it's now a token of status and wealth to have a massive over-the-top wedding. And speaking of massive, let's get into the wedding industry giants. So the wedding industry is made up of thousands of independent vendors, from photographers, florists, DJs, planners, etc. Every one of these vendors sets their own own pricing relative to the category that they're in. And The Knot is one of the behemoths in the wedding space that monetizes vendor listings, advertising. They have a registry and also planning tools. And per The Knot site, they help 4 million couples connect with roughly 900,000 vendors through their global platform each year. But what's wild about The Knot, and I've done a shorter video about this on my social pages, but there has been a ton of press over the last year about The Knot's very questionable business practices. And one of the more recent articles came from The New Yorker in March, and it lays out the experiences of vendors that signed up on the platform who have been contacted by what they claim to be fake brides. And they also claim that they've been locked into advertising contracts on the site that are very hard to get out of. And Zola is a registry meets wedding website. And per latest estimates, Zola brings in around $120 million in revenue. And their latest valuation was at $600 million. Both The Knot and Zola rely on their registry network for part of their revenue. But for the companies who own the registries, they leverage their platforms to create customer pipelines for retailers. According to Zola, the average person spends $150 on a wedding gift. And there's also been a shift in the types of gifts that people are even giving. Since many couples are paying for their own weddings out of their own savings accounts, more couples than ever are including cash payment options as part of their registries. And if you think about it, a wedding registry is such a great place for a brand to establish a relationship with couples, especially if these couples are building a home together and will potentially have children someday. It makes sense that brands would really want to be featured on a registry site. And platforms like Zola and Amazon get a cut from every gift, and they also upsell the analytics to brands. And wedding registries are such valuable pieces of online real estate, so many brands even pay to be featured in registry guides or bundles. And in terms of the wedding retail giants now, the older retail players in this space have gone through a tough time. David's Bridal is one of the largest wedding dress retailers in the US. They went through bankruptcy not once, but twice. And now they're owned by private equity, and they're attempting a rebrand in a couple ways. First, they're on a major PR push at the moment, and the Wall Street Journal even came out with an article in April about how they were trying to go upmarket in the dress space. So they will now be competing with even higher end players in the gown industry, and they're also introducing luxury gowns. And their first luxury partnership is with Marchesa. And beyond the actual wedding dress retailers themselves, all sorts of clothing retailers are jumping on the wedding train. It's actually very commonplace now for companies to feature some kind of wedding shop or wedding capsule that appeals to both brides and wedding attendees. Nowadays, there's not just one wedding dress that people are shopping for. They're shopping for the welcome party, the rehearsal dinner, the after party dress, the next day brunch dress. And that's all on top of the bachelorette weekend that's happened before the wedding. An example of a retailer who I think does this wedding shop really well is Abercrombie & Fitch. They've majorly benefited from offering the wedding offerings to their e-commerce platform, and they're not alone. Revolve has done this, Saks has done this, and pretty much any major retailer or e-commerce site that has women's clothing is doing something like this. And the final piece of the wedding retail angle that I want to chat about is the thriving market for secondhand wedding dresses. For my own wedding, I wore a Monique Lhuillier dress, and it was incredibly beautiful, but very expensive, and it just happened to be over my budget. But I was able to justify it to myself by telling myself that I would sell it afterwards. To do this, I used a site called Still White, and I ended up getting over 70% of the full price of the dress back when I sold it. No, I am not sponsored by Still White, but I still tell everyone that unless you're holding onto a dress for some form of sentimental reason, selling a dress is the easiest way to make your money back on your wedding expenses. The wedding Instagram effect is so real. So I want to talk about this because I feel like I can't talk about the wedding industrial complex without talking about the impact that social media has had on the entire industry. And according to a Vogue spokesperson, over 25% of the Vogue website traffic goes to their Vogue weddings page. And it makes sense that people love consuming this type of content. It's usually highly documented and very aesthetic. Of course, for many aspiring influencers, it happens to become their entire personality. And I personally think back to Sophia Richie Grange's wedding in April 2021. 2023 and how that wedding was all over social media. People analyzed everything about it, from the multiple outfits she wore, the old money aesthetic that she was doing, and every detail was broken down across Instagram and TikTok. But the reality is that social media has escalated expectation of what is normal. From the floral ceilings to drone photography to fireworks at the after party, the content that usually does the best on social media is the most over the top and unique. And in order to capture all of this content, weddings are now treated like full content productions, and they have full dedicated photo opportunities and mood boards to address this. And the Wall Street Journal even came out with this full article called "Does Your Wedding Need a Social Media Concierge?" It talks about how some brides opt for an additional person on top of their traditional photographer and videographer, and this new person is incremental, who shoots their content straight onto an iPhone. And these wedding content creators, or wedding social media managers, whatever you want to call them, help to generate social media footage based on the trends of the moment at the big day. And the rise of these multi-event weddings, the welcome parties, the rehearsal dinners, the after parties and content days, it all feeds into the added costs of the wedding. I want to leave you with my predictions for the wedding industry. So I have a handful of them. But first, going back to what I said earlier, microweddings are only going to continue to grow in popularity. And of course, this is also driven by necessity. I think the new normal for weddings will be much smaller guest lists with much more intimate occasions. And I think we're going to see even more secondhand dresses and also low waist events pop up, and lots of custom details. Since everything with weddings will be downsizing, I think that there's more opportunity with customization with each individual element, such as handwritten guest notes and even little goodie bags for the guests at the end of the night. I think overall, the personalization element will start to become even bigger than it is today. Now, here's the recap. The wedding industry is no longer just about love. It's a commercial ecosystem that is shaped by tradition, tech, and TikTok. And my final thought for you today is that the transformation that we're seeing of the wedding industrial complex is really just a reflection of where we are economically. A wedding should be a reflection of the couple, not of what the couple wants a random stranger on the internet to think about them. But then again, this is the basic premise of social media nowadays. People are encouraged to show their highlight reels, and a wedding day, in many senses, is the ultimate highlight reel. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Social Currency. I've been wanting to launch this show for so long. I can't tell you how excited I am to do this, and how thrilled I am that you're actually here listening. It means the world to me. If you liked what you heard today, please rate and review the podcast, because it massively helps to support the work I do to bring the show to life. And if you want to keep up with the hottest business lore in real time, follow me on Instagram at Sammy Cohen Talks, and subscribe to my newsletter, Social Currency, which is linked in the show notes. Social Currency is a production of Social Currency Media and Money News Network. The podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Sammy Cohen. Social Currency is produced by the Money News Network team. See you next time.